Good evening. What you see in front of you right now is a picture of the Voya office building on Washington Street in downtown Minneapolis. It was ING before, and it was ReliaStar when I was working for them, and when I left at the end of 2001. And what I want to talk about today is my work history and what was my profession, what was I paid to do, and what did I have maybe some authority to speak about based on what I was paid to do versus the writing I did and the books, and of course selling the books, that those. And so I want to go over my resume, and it'll bring up an interesting point about if you write, do you need to make a living in it? Do you write what you have to say because you think you have something important to say based on what something that happened in your own life and you don't care that much whether people pay for it, or should you have to prove you can make a living at it if you're going to have an effect on policy, which I think I did. So let's go to my resume. And I'm going to actually go in chronological order. So I'm going to go back to to um, to the beginning. Back in actually when I was an undergraduate, um, I started. Well, I had a job at the National Bureau of Standards for a year as a chemist or rheology in 1963 for a year. That was one thing as a GS4, and then I worked 3 summers at the David Taylor Model Basin, which was in Carter, Maryland, um, which was what it said. It had a model for boats, and it was a program, Fortran programmer for 3 summers. And then I was in graduate school. I was an assistant instructor in graduate school, and taught most of 2 semesters. I actually lost the assistantship because of student complaints the first semester, but got it back and created some controversy because it was a remedial course. So I flunked a lot of students, and with military draft on, that was for men, that was a controversial thing to do. That's something I've written about. And indeed part of my story. And then I also worked for a year for a couple of professors, engineering professors, doing Fortran programming at the University of Kansas. So I was actually working when I was a graduate student. And then I started then I was in the Army, and I was um, after basic, and I wound up in special training for 4 weeks in basic training because I was way behind physically. That's another story. But I wound up assignments at the Pentagon, which I lost probably because of a security clearance problem because of my fake psychiatric history and apparent latent homosexuality. That whole thing I've explained before, and sort of previews the gays in the military debate that I would get into later. But I spent the last 16 months or so at Fort Eustis, working for the Combat Development Command Transportation Agency, just really doing kind of a data project called Spiral, where it didn't really do very much. But then when I um, got out of the Army in February of 1970, I started working for RCA in Princeton, the Princeton Labs, near downtown Princeton. And it was my first time living in my own apartment. That was the Operations Research Career Program. And that you were given several assignments over the year. And one of them was in Indianapolis, another one was in Cherry Hill. But those were the days you coded Fortran, in coding sheets and had it key punched and had shots at a machine, and there really wasn't enough computer time to get the projects done. I got laid off from that. That was the only layoff I had at the beginning of 1971, until the end of 2001. So I had a real good record after that. Um, and a friend of mine that I had met in the chess club had worked for NAVCOS, or the Naval Command System Support Activity. So I worked there for about 18 months, from spring of 1971 till the fall of 1972. And once again, I learned some assembler as where I was working on the UNIVAC 1108. Once again, the top secret security clearance was coming up soon. And I got a call from UNIVAC, and I went to work for UNIVAC on the same as a site rep. And that was interesting. I left home for good, left Arlington for good for 16 years, essentially. And of course, I visited, but worked in Morristown, New Jersey, and then had an internal transfer down a little bit south to Piscataway, New Jersey, which is near New Brunswick. And also worked on particularly a big benchmark project with Bell Labs. But I didn't really code anything. I ran benchmarks and traveled to Minneapolis a lot. Still no expertise in training thing. But because when I came out the second time, I wanted to live in New York City. And getting into the city where I could be in the community and meet people quickly and live efficiently was a high priority. So a friend of mine who I had known at RCA called me back, and essentially when I went to National Broadcasting Company in August of 1974, which was the Monday after Nixon resigned from Watergate, when I went to that, it was essentially like returning to RCA. So back from a layoff. So I actually got extra vacation time, and that actually worked out pretty well. And then worked on a general ledger system, a purchase system, worked in ASCII COBOL, still on the UNIVAC 1110. But I was very concerned about getting our IBM experience. Everybody in those days, the job market was that you needed to have IBM, because IBM was squeezing out all the other competition, UNIVAC and Burroughs, and DEC and so on. So I managed to leave NBC in May of 1977 and worked for Medicaid MMIS for New York for about 20 months. And that was one of the best times in my life, socially and personally, and it was a pretty stable time. Still lived on 11th Street in the cast iron building. Worked in a COBOL system on MBS in a back-end reporting system called MARS, MARS, not the planet, but I decided a personal situation happened that I'll talk about in another video sometime. I think I've talked about it before once, but I just decided to start over and move to another part of the country. So I moved to Dallas, and in January 1979, I started working for the Combined Medicare Consortium, which was a group of 7 Blue Cross and Blue Shield plans that were trying to develop a combined Medicare system. And they had a methodology called Pride Logic, a very strict methodology for filling in things and building them. And they got their own little data center. It was very crude. This was still, data centers were very crude to build, and it was kind of hard to get work done. And because of political infighting, the project kind of failed. So I had to look for another job. Fortunately, I had an inside referral and went to work for Chilton in October of, I think it was October of, it was November 2nd. That's right. It was November 2nd of 1981. And I was there until June of 1988. I was living in Dallas, and during that time, the AIDS crisis personally came into my life. I never got HIV. I kind of wised up. Um, I volunteered a lot. It was a big political issue for the gay community then, which we'll talk about again later. But I fortunately got through it. Only one person, there were a lot of, it was near downtown Dallas, and there were a lot of gay people who worked there, but only one person got AIDS. And it was about the time I was leaving. Um, so actually at work, we didn't really have a problem. Um, then when I decided to come back to Washington, Chilton got bought by TRW, which is now Experian, which is actually 30 miles up the road in McAllen, Texas, I think now, but up 175. But decided to come back to DC closer to my mother, and I had a very strange job from the summer of 1988 through the end of 1989 with Lewin ICF. It started with a consulting group formed out of Virginia's Blue Cross and Blue Shield to develop reporting on hospital operating margins for Medicare. And that was COBOL. And there was a model I took over that we would run for clients and so forth and produce reports. And then we got sold to Lewin ICF, which actually the company is still doing quite well now. It's really expanded. It's in Northern Virginia. But I decided to get to a more conventional shop, which led me to the last major job that I had, which was started out to be with Uslico Corporation in Arlington, near where 66 meets Lee Road, near Ballston. Uslico focused on selling life insurance to the military. That was one of its subsidiaries, United Services Life. But there was also Bankers Security that had other kinds of, that had mainly salary deduction, group policies for employers, or not group policies, but actual bundled policies. And I worked on a system that reported on that more efficiently. And I stayed, and then I decided as my personal life developed and as the debate on gays in the military heated up in the middle 90s when Bill Clinton was president, I decided to write a book based on the idea that forced intimacy among people of the same sex was a big issue for me when I was living in a dorm, and that translated to the way that the military ban was being debated in the 90s, particularly by Sam Nunn and Charles Moskos. And so I wrote a big autobiographical book. And because I was working with a company that had a lot of clientele in the military, we were concerned that there would be a conflict of interest, if I potentially a conflict of interest if I stayed in Arlington. So I transferred, and in the meantime, Northwestern National Life bought Uslico in 1995, and that they were in Minneapolis, and they were renamed as Reliostar, and I transferred to them in September of 1997, 2 months after I published the book. And I would be there for 4.5 years. But then after 9/11 would, then ING would buy Reliostar in the middle of 2000. And then the 9/11 attacks would have a big effect on Reliostar and contribute to the layoff. And I was given laid off and given a big severance package at the end of 2001. So that was 30 years after the other layoff. And one of the things you notice about the kind of work I did, I was an individual contributor. I didn't have direct reports. And so I didn't really make decisions about who got insurance or anything. So things, I was starting, to express my opinions in a book, but I was starting to put the book online also where it could be found by search engines, which was the topic of my previous video, that could create a conflict of interest. But I was an individual contributor, so I didn't make decisions that affected anybody. So that was seemed to be all right. At the time, it was mainly search engines were the way you could be found. But then I had the job market sort of collapsed after 9/11. You had to kind of be in a niche and get a contract. There were jobs like in MMIS, or if you had enough years of one thing, of one kind of social program system with the state government, you could sort of get jobs. But it was hard to get jobs after that, the way I used to. So I started having to branch out. And before I left Minneapolis, I actually had a job with the Minnesota Orchestra calling and for contributions to the youth, to the young people's concerts. And I also then, for the last 2.5 months before I came back to Arlington to be closer to Mother, I worked as a debt collector for a company called RMA, and in a long, big building near the Minneapolis St. Paul Airport. So I was a debt collector for a little while. And I could have stayed there, but I decided to come back to Arlington. His mother had had a heart attack. And in 1999, she had coronary bypass surgery, which was a surprise that they would even want to do it. But I was concerned I would be forced to come back to Arlington or that they wouldn't do it. Fortunately, that didn't happen. I stayed and wasn't really disrupted, but that was a big concern for a while. But you can see where this is headed. I would have interviews for various kinds of odd jobs. I did do another job. I did do work for a little company that was getting contributions for the National Symphony until the end of 2003, but they were doing something. They were calling after hours, and people complained, so I decided to quit because they were actually doing something a little bit illegal. And I didn't want to stay there if they were. I looked at another collection agency, actually was in Maryland. I didn't get that. I looked at Independence Air, the possibility of being a gate agent, and the job interview, which was out at Dulles Airport, was to give a talk about a previous job. That was an interesting experience. I didn't get that. It was only $9.50 an hour, but I got 2 free round trips on Independence Air to use anytime I wanted as a result for just doing the interview. So I took advantage of that. And I interviewed to be a mailman, a delivery person in the United States Postal Service courier. At the time I was doing the interview, I had a bad tooth problem, which kind of got in the way, but also I had had a fall in Minneapolis, and they couldn't get my medical records to make sure that I would be physically okay, so that didn't work out. And I got a couple of calls to be life insurance agents. Now, if you worked for a life insurance company for a number of time, shouldn't you be able to sell what you did? That's the theory. And I didn't want to call people. I also interviewed for a company that would convert whole life insurance to term. You were supposed to call people and get them to convert whole life policies to term. That was going to be the job. I didn't want to call people and pester them. Why? I don't like to be approached in public. When I go pick up my mail in Boston and so forth, I don't like to approach people. I don't like them to approach me. But that's the way the world is. You had to be willing to be aggressive. And many of these, the idea back then was you were supposed to make a living by being a middleman, by selling things and getting a commission. That was considered a socially legitimate thing to do, to call and approach people and pester them. But with the internet, that started becoming a less acceptable thing to do, and less desirable. I also was approached about being a tax preparer in 2008, and would have started at $8.50 an hour or something. And I didn't want to get into that, but I don't have as much of an excuse for staying out of that one. I wound up, yeah, I did get money from the inheritance, and when mother died at the end of 2010, and caring for her was a big deal particularly in the last 18 months. We had caregivers all the time, and we spent $80,000 of her money for caregiving. But fortunately, there was still a lot left, and so I published the 3 books at different times. And the first, I had a separate printing of my own for the first one, and it sold reasonably well for 2 or 3 years when I was in Minneapolis. The others haven't sold that much, but recently my publisher has been after me more to do all kinds of things to sell more copies of these older books. When what I really need to do, and I explained in a video a couple of weeks ago, is bring everything up to date so I have something new to sell. But it's not okay anymore just to express your views, even with well-intended critical thinking about issues, gratuitously, if people don't pay you for it, because and if you have money from another source, because you may be competing with other people who need to do it for a living, which is really what I'm running into, and that's an ethical problem in itself. So the next video after this one, I'll talk about a little more about some of the other issues I ran into when I was blogging, and some interesting issues, and then I'm going to talk a little about sexual orientation and gender identity and my own connection to it. I'm going to give you a little bit more nuance in that soon. But I do thank you for listening to this today.